introduction. Okay. Yep, I'm Kara. I've met a lot of you, and I'm working with Mike, as you know, on Athabasca Grown. This project's going to last until like the end of this year. We got the series of workshops. This is the third one, so there's two more. So I hope y'all will look to come out to those. We're not going to really talk about our projects at length today because we have two awesome speakers. I'm so glad that we could pull this together. Veronica's here from Ontario, and Rob came up, and you've probably recognized him from his YouTube videos. So we're going to give them, a lot of time. They're going to do their presentations, and we're going to have time at the end for like an extended discussion, question and answer period. So, yeah, I'll just say one thing. Like we met earlier today before this internally, Rob and Veronica and the Faculty of Architecture. We also have Douglas McLeod and Trevor Butler here from AU. So they're, part of this project representing AU. We had a couple local people. I don't know if I want to embarrass or name you. Anyway, you probably heard him before, Steve Souls, who he did a presentation, and Michelle. So we all kind of brought our minds together and helped develop thinking like what's possible around this idea, around this project in this community. And then we're going to direct it back to you. There. Hi. We're going to direct it back to you in the community for, what do you want to see out of it? So really exciting. And I probably talked too much. So I guess first up we have Rob. Do you want to say anything, Mike? Yeah. Yep. Thanks to everybody I didn't name. So I don't have a proper introduction, but Rob Avis.
Yeah, sounds good.
Oh.
All right, well, welcome everybody. And I just wanted to say thank you to the crew at Athabasca. It's been awesome okay, perfect. It's been awesome to get to know everybody, and I'm really excited to be up here. I've actually wanted to come to Athabasca for a very long time. It's my first time visiting your quaint town, and it did not disappoint. So how many people here would be super excited about, so I gotta turn this guy on, right? How many people here would be super excited about bringing a piece of Mexico into your backyard? Put up your hand. Okay. What's that? Well, whatever you want. A subtropical piece, possibly a tropical piece. So tonight we're going to go pretty quickly through the basics of what makes up a passive solar greenhouse. I don't have a ton of slides, but I've got a ton of stories, and I'm sure that we'll have a lot of questions at the end, and I'll make sure that I answer as many of them as I can. As I said, my name is Rob Avis. I've been teaching permaculture for the last almost 20 years. I've taught close to 10,000 people around the world on regenerative design, and I've been playing with passive solar greenhouses for most of that time. I started my journey in passive solar greenhouses by building a small 200 square foot space in my backyard in Calgary. We had a 5,000 square foot postage size lot, and there was one spot on that lot that I could put a passive solar greenhouse. And at the time I was designing passive homes, and I thought it would be a really great idea to put an overhang on the greenhouse to cancel out some of the light to reduce the overheating that all greenhouses suffer from. But I forgot, because I'm an engineer and I was new to ecology and biology, that plants actually need light to live. So cutting out the light coming into a greenhouse is not a good idea. And I made a ton of mistakes on that greenhouse, and I've made a lot of mistakes on other greenhouses as well, as I've learned. I'm happy to say that the greenhouses that we're designing and building now are working really fantastic. And yes, you can replicate a Mexican climate or in fact, the climate that I'm replicating in a greenhouse that I'm designing right now is actually a Panama climate, just close to Mexico. And it'll have bananas and avocados and guavas and figs, hammocks, possibly a hot tub. And that's just part of it. The second part of the greenhouse is replicating the Okanagan. And so that means that we can grow peaches and pears and all the other stuff that typically don't grow outside in Alberta. And so when we're building a greenhouse, what we're actually doing is we're mimicking an ecosystem that's not from here. And if you guys are growing food in this climate, you know how tough it is. I live in Wetaskiwin, which isn't that far south. We still get to minus 35. We're still part of Alberta. We still have 100 frost-free days. It's very, very challenging to grow food where we are. Last year, our last frost day was June 1st, and our first frost day, I believe, was somewhere between September 15th and October 1st. And so very short seasons. We get hail, as you guys probably do up here, and we have cold nights. And so I didn't actually want to stay in Alberta. My wife is from here. I'm originally from Vancouver. I've grown to love the province, but I said, if we're going to live in this province, I need to at least bring a piece of BC with me that I can plant in my backyard. And so my greenhouse gives me anywhere from 200 to 230 frost-free days a year. I don't actually grow 4 seasons, I just grow 3 seasons, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the slides. And so one of the first things you have to think about if you're going to build one of these structures, which we'll detail out here shortly, is what climate do you want to mimic? What are your goals? Do you just want to extend the growing season past the 100 days? Do you want to grow perennials like trees that don't typically grow here? Do you want a place that you can go to in the middle of the winter time when you have SAD, seasonal affective disorder, where you can suntan naked amongst your figs and get all the vitamin D that your body actually needs that you don't typically get because we're stuck inside of our houses because it's so bloody cold outside? These are really, really important questions that you have to ask in order to be able to basically drive the design process in a passive solar greenhouse. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess I can do that here. Perfect. Okay, so I just wanted to give a bit of context. I think it's important to understand a few kind of key factors around these spaces. So Alberta and Saskatchewan are very interesting places. We have this really low natural gas price, which does really funny things to the way that we look at the economics of greenhouses. So we pay about $3 a gigajoule. Most people don't know what a gigajoule is. It's a lot of energy. And so if and one of the most confusing things that we do in the energy industry is that we have all these different units with kilowatt hours and gigajoules and therms and cubic meters of gas. And so it's no wonder most people are completely energy illiterate because it's super hard to understand what all these different units mean. So if we normalize natural gas to a kilowatt hour, which is what we measure our electricity in, it turns out to be about 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And I would argue that it's ostensibly free. The current power prices that we pay in Alberta run between 15 and 20 cents per kilowatt hour and will likely continue to increase. So natural gas is almost 20 times, 15 to 20 times less expensive than electricity. And the reason this is important is if you go to the southern part of our province, you'll find acres and acres and acres of what you would, when I say the word greenhouse, it's a house that's covered in glass on all sides. And they're growing tomatoes and cucumbers. And if you've ever wondered like how they do that, a pane of glass has the R value of about 1, which is basically nothing. And so the reason they're able to operate these greenhouses is because natural gas is basically free. And when we look at the cost of electricity, as you guys know, it gets very dark here in the wintertime. We get very short days. The sunlight doesn't have a lot of energy in it. And so from a greenhouse grower's perspective, what they're trying to do is they're saying, well, the cost to light the greenhouse is 20 times more expensive than the cost to heat the greenhouse. Therefore, we're going to optimize the design of the greenhouse to let as much light in. So we have to spend less electricity providing artificial light than like we'd rather design for optimizing light than optimizing heat because it's so cheap to heat them. So somebody in the group that we were discussing today was basically saying, like, you're not a greenhouse company if you're selling greenhouses. You're actually just a boiler company. You're selling boilers, and greenhouses just kind of give you a little bit of protection around the boiler, essentially. And so it's like you just dump, and like you think about natural gas. Natural gas, I always say, is like using natural gas to heat is like cutting butter with a chainsaw, because it burns at 1200 degrees Celsius and we're heating spaces to 21 degrees Celsius. It's a mismatch of fuels. But when you're surrounding your crops with a material that has an R value of 1, you need to use jet fuel to keep those spaces warm. Now, a couple of interesting facts. So we talked a little bit about climate change this afternoon when we were kind of uncovering how to look at a potential community greenhouse up here. The Alberta greenhouse industry in Alberta produces 234,000 metric tons of CO2 per year. They're literally just emitting CO2 into the air and so that we can eat our tomatoes. And I think this is really important because another thing we talked about today is that in 2025, when you go buy a calorie of food from the grocery store, it consumes 20 to 30 calories of hydrocarbon energy to produce that food so that you can eat it. So if we were all coyotes running around going and harvesting our food and we had to invest 20 to 30 of our calories of our energy to get 1 calorie of food, we'd all starve to death. And so our entire food system is built on top of a pyramid that looks like this, that is fundamentally dependent upon an exponentially growing amount of energy, whether that's coming from Mexico, whether that's from greenhouses, or even kind of the larger conventional agriculture system. And this isn't to say that we should be frustrated or angry, or I'm not pointing fingers at farmers. I'm so grateful for all of the farmers out there. But we have a societal problem that we have to deal with, which is that we have to start producing food again that's net positive. So in the 1940s, every calorie of hydrocarbon energy that went into our farm system produced 3 calories of food. Okay, so 1 in, 3 out. Today it's 20 or 30 in and 1 out. And so the reason that we did this is because we were optimizing for labor. So we could deploy machines and fossil fuels cheaper than we could deploy labor. And so we've just mechanized and fossil fuelized the farms in order to bring the cost of food down and to allow for a lower labor force to basically grow the food that used to be required to grow food 100 years ago. Passive solar greenhouses, which we're going to show some slides up here next, typically use about 90% less energy. And we did a study, which I'm going to share with you at the end of this talk, where we looked at greenhouses in Niagara, Calgary, Colorado, and Kamloops, just to kind of get a smattering of different locations. And some of the locations like Kamloops and Niagara, you were able to operate these greenhouses without any energy input. And then places like Alberta, or Calgary, I should say, and Colorado required small amounts of energy, but still 90% less than conventional structures. Just an interesting fact, 35% of the ops cost of a conventional greenhouse is in heating. So in spite of natural gas being basically free, it still represents 35% of the operating costs. So you can see how much energy is required to keep one of these structures heated. And then another thing that's important as you guys are kind of navigating the ideas around creating a passive solar greenhouse here or some sort of a food system, conventional greenhouses cost between $20 to $30 a square foot. Passive solar greenhouses can cost, $100 up, $150 even sometimes. And I've built a couple of multi-million-dollar greenhouses. They're not really greenhouses, let's be honest. There's a golf simulator in the back. There's a couple of root cellars. There's a commercial kitchen, maybe a hot tub or two. And so yes, they produce food, but they do a whole bunch of other things as well. And so it really depends on, like, you can use these buildings for multiple functions, and they can be something as simple as a community greenhouse that provides food security to your community, all the way up to a recreation space. Yep. Totally. I'm going to answer that question as part of the presentation. Yeah. So we have a whole bunch of, and in fact, if you really want to deep dive into it, the white paper, I've got a QR code at the end. You can go check it out for free. And it shows all the different tests that we've done and like where those energy savings are. And if I don't get exactly to your question, we have a Q&A period afterwards. So make sure you ask that then. So I'm just going to point to this one here. We've got the purple here is a conventional greenhouse. The orange is an insulated conventional greenhouse. So imagine, I'm just going to forward one slide here, but even though this is a small greenhouse, this is a conventional greenhouse. So when I say the word conventional, I mean it has glazing on all sides versus a passive. But we're going to show more photos of this here shortly. So a conventional greenhouse with insulation on the east, west, and north side uses this much energy. And then it's really hard to see, but this tiny little sliver on the bottom, that's what a passive solar greenhouse will use in an equivalent climate. So much similar to, or very similar to the passive house movement. Passive houses generally use 90% less energy than conventional houses or houses built without passive solar design thinking in it. Passive solar greenhouses have a similar performance curve. So, yeah, conventional greenhouses are actually amazing structures. I think, like, in fact, if you read the white paper that I'm talking about, or I've talked about, the Romans are actually one of the first inventors of the greenhouse. They were using sheets of silica, I think it was silica, as their glazing, because they didn't have glass back then, in order to try and grow citrus in places that it typically wouldn't grow. And so humans have been trying to manipulate our microclimates for a long time in order to try and gain an advantage with regards to food production. So there's a very long history of greenhouses within our culture. And so something like this generally will cost less money and will take 100 growing days and we'll extend it to 150. So you'll get another half of a growing season, maybe even 3/4 of a growing season before it's going to freeze at night. And it all depends on how the year kind of lines out. This greenhouse here cost my clients, I think it was $40,000 for the kit. And then there's a bunch of work, like they really went all out with this concrete foundation. And so it ended up costing quite a bit more, but it doesn't have to cost that much. And so you can do a lot to extend your vegetable garden just by using a structure similar to this. Now, this is a cross section of a greenhouse that I'm working on right now. This one's going to go into North Dakota. And there's a few things that make this structure different than this structure. So number one is that, and this will kind of answer your question, they have insulated walls on the north, east, and then you can't see the west, sorry, that's the west side. You can't see the east side here. And so where this greenhouse here has about an R value of 1.2, 1.5 on the glazing surface. Does everybody know what R value means when I say that? Anybody not know what R value means? Okay, the insulation value of a wall. We generally try and spec these walls to have an R value of about 20, which seems low. Like when you look at passive house design in North America, we're aiming for like R40, R50, R60 in the walls. So why would we have such a low R value in a passive solar greenhouse? And the answer is because the glazing, and I'll talk about this here in a slide coming up, the glazing has an R value of about 1.8. So it's about 1/10 of that of the wall. Our primary heat loss leaves out of that glazing. And so up to 50% of the heat loss in a passive solar greenhouse just leaves out of the glazing surface, the glass or the polycarbonate. So adding more insulation to the insulated walls actually has a very little impact on overall heat loss. Our greenhouses tend to have these climate batteries in them. And so a climate battery is a device that was invented by a guy named John Cruikshank in Colorado in the 1980s. He's fortunately passed away now. And he said, what if we take the surplus energy from the greenhouse during the summer and the fall, and we pump that energy with air underground through a manifold, and then through pipes, and you can kind of see the outlet pipe right here on the back. And we heat that soil mass up to about 25 degrees Celsius through the summer. Would that soil mass carry the greenhouse through the wintertime? And so the same thing that's allowing our plants to grow, the soil, acts as a primary thermal battery or thermal mass inside of a greenhouse. Unfortunately, we can't heat that soil up much past 25 degrees Celsius because the plants will start to suffer. And so we have real limitations with regards to how much energy we can actually store in that system. And recently, I've got another white paper that I'm going to share with you at the end. A gentleman that's coming out here to speak, Rob Lyle, is going to be talking about his greenhouse in Ontario. And the University of Guelph did some really great research on this and determined that these climate batteries actually store and release more energy than they consume through the use of that fan. So they're a really cool system. And these climate batteries are not, you don't have to just use them in a passive solar greenhouse. You can use them in conventional greenhouses as well. And what it will do is it will increase that soil temperature, which increases the growing degree days in your greenhouse, which will get you red tomatoes earlier. That's what it actually means for the grower. So the first thing we have to do with one of these structures is build a foundation. And so this looks like a giant bathtub. This is my backyard on my farm. And so we built a 4-foot ICF foundation. This is 20 by 40 feet long. And every 8 feet, we have a 10-foot deep pile going underneath this wall. So that's what gives our structure strength against the backfill. Because really what's going to happen with this greenhouse is we're going to fill it up with soil. There's no concrete foundation on the bottom of here. And so we have to make sure those walls are properly supported when we backfill on the outside. We build these climate batteries out of conventional PVC pipe that you'd see in a city waterworks system. And then big O tubing, which is what you typically see around the outside of a building to make sure that it drains properly. And that's literally the whole climate battery. There's 2 rows of pipes. My greenhouse has about 34 big O pipes. And then I've got an automated system that basically tells the fan when to turn on and when to turn off in order to optimize thermal storage. So this is the foot or the foundation of the greenhouse. Just to say that I don't believe that a passive solar greenhouse is a replacement for a garden. Okay, and so we were talking about this today too. Most greenhouses have about a 3-year honeymoon period before you want to get divorced from it. And that's because not only do you want a space in your backyard that replicates Mexico, but all those lovely bugs do too. And so after about 3 years, those bugs will start to normalize inside the greenhouse. And the solution is not herbicides or pesticides. The solutions is to try and understand what's going on from an ecosystem perspective. And there are solutions to all of these problems, but every year you're going to find a new problem in your greenhouse that you're going to have to solve. So 2 years ago, we had a lot of heat. We ended up being on vacation for a little bit, so we had a bit of water stress in the greenhouse, and our greenhouse exploded with powdery mildew. And we'd never seen powdery mildew this bad before. And so we lost most of our crop. And then last year we got it again, because now once the powdery mildew is established, it's not going away. Turns out when you start talking to other greenhouse growers, the solution is raw milk. And so luckily one of my neighbors makes milk for cats. We got some of that raw milk and we watered it down and sprayed all the plants, and the powdery mildew basically subsided. And so there's lots of solutions to these problems, but you will see problems in your greenhouse that you do not see in a conventional garden. So as I mentioned, insulated north, east, and west sides. We glaze it on the south side of the building. So this is my greenhouse. Typically built with a knee wall on the south side for snow accumulation. So all the snow that falls on this greenhouse lands in front of this wall here. It's a big problem. And if you guys build one of them here, it's a maintenance item that has to be considered, because that front wall is a hinge point. And so if you've got large sums of snow pushing up against that wall, it creates a lot of stress on the envelope. So you have to be really careful about that. thinking about how you're going to accommodate for the snow coming off. And then, as I said, R20 is about the optimal R value for this climate. So you don't need to go much heavier on the insulation. This is the $1 million greenhouse in Kamloops. This site was under construction when I took this picture. And so this greenhouse has a commercial kitchen, 3 root cellars. Each root cellar has a different climatic zone. So we have a meat aging room. We have a cold, humid root cellar that's cooled with earth tubes. And we have a dry, cool root cellar for dry goods. So one of the design constraints here was to be able to supply a year's supply of food for 20 people and store it inside of this greenhouse. We're currently growing tropicals in this greenhouse right now. And actually, this wasn't part of the presentation, but I'm going to say it now just as I'm looking at it. If you don't have $1 million and you want to extend your greenhouse, and you don't need $1 million to build a passive solar greenhouse, by the way, but this is probably one of the most, and I'll just use my pointer over here too, one of the most amazing microclimate generators I have ever seen. And you can build it for whatever the cost of those 2x4s and some, you can't see it too well in the picture, but there's glazing on the bottom layer here. I have never found a cheaper way to get red tomatoes in Alberta in August than this. And so what happens is you get this, because of this glazing here, you end up getting like an inversion going on inside of here, and it kind of holds the heat. And so this is like probably the smart man's passive solar greenhouse right here. If you don't have a ton of resources, this will do amazing things to your hot season crops. Now, when we're designing these things, there's this funny trade-off that happens with light. And when we glaze a surface, what we're doing is we're trying to separate the plants from the environment outside. And we want to get the highest insulative value on this glazing that we can, but we can't go below 70% transmissivity of the light. So as our insulation value on the glazing goes up, the amount of light that comes through goes down. And when we get below 70%, our plants get really unhappy. And so 70% is kind of the number that we stick with, because that allows me to get an R value of about 1.8. There are some other technologies out there that kind of get better than polycarbonate, and I think there's new stuff being built all the time. But polycarbonate has a lot of advantages. One of the advantages of polycarbonate, if you look back in the books from the 1970s, when people started thinking about these types of structures, they used to say that you needed to set the glazing angle of the greenhouse to where the sun was perpendicular in the sky in the season that you wanted to grow. So you guys get really low sun here, just like me. And so if the sun is like at 17 degrees or 20 degrees or whatever the number is, then typically those 1970s greenhouses would have glazing angles that were almost vertical. You've seen this in the earthships and things like that. The reason they did that was because back then they used glass. And when when sunlight hits glass, if it's not hitting it perpendicular, it refracts and it goes in all sorts of different directions. Polycarbonate is kind of cool. It's like, if you've ever been into a polycarbonate greenhouse, you might start questioning if you're a vampire because your shadow disappears. And I'm serious. It's like it diffuses the light and you have no shadow. It's like, what the heck is happening here? I might be a vampire. And so what's really nice about that is that you can basically set whatever angle you want in your greenhouse, because as the light hits this surface, it breaks apart. And the plants love growing in light that's broken apart. And so then the angle of the greenhouse is more dictated by snow load. So the steeper we get, the smaller the rafters or trusses can be. And then the other thing that kind of becomes a constraint is the tall wall in the back. And so we have to be really careful about making these back walls too tall. So there's a bunch of things that we do to try and optimize for that. This is the inside of our greenhouse. It's really important, and I've learned the hard way, and you're going to see another big mistake that I made. But it's really important that we have reflective surfaces. Most people don't know this, but white, the color white, has about this 3 or 4% less reflectivity than a mirror. So if a mirror is 99%, a white wall might be 96 or 95%. And so because we're reducing the aperture in here, we have to make sure that the surfaces inside are reflecting that light back around so that the plants have enough light to grow. And so we want reflective surfaces. We want them to be washable. That's why we use low rib tin. And we want the system to be indifferent to humidity because these structures can get very humid, especially when we get into the shoulder seasons. Now, this is one of the big, massive design improvements, as well as one of the big mistakes that I've made. And so this, if you watch my YouTube videos, this is the solar wall that I fabricated out of just using conventional soffit. And so it's perforated metal. And as the sun comes in, it heats that wall up. And then I extract the air from the wall, and then I push it down underground here into that manifold system that I talked about. So the solar wall works awesome. Like it heats up the soil really well. It's improved the performance of the climate battery dramatically. But black is not a good surface to grow your plants against. And so now our greenhouses have a solar wall up top where the plants are not interfacing with the wall. And we're putting white tin down below, the 2/3 basically. So we still get the benefit of some solar thermal gain, but we also get the benefit of having that reflectivity in the greenhouse. This is about a 300 or 400 watt fan, and it operates when the temperature goes above 21 to store energy, and it operates again when the temperature goes below 12 degrees Celsius to act as a heating system for the greenhouse. The paper that Rob Lyle, who's coming to speak to you guys, talks about, so I'd recommend downloading it, claims that the COP of this system, coefficient of performance, meaning every watt of energy that we put into the system, we get 3.61 to 6.51 for heating. Actually, I've got my, yeah, sorry, that should be heating, not cooling. Sorry about that. And then for cooling, sorry, that's really confusing. It's up here, my bad. Heating, we get a COP or coefficient of performance of 2.5. So that means that every watt of energy I put into the fan, I get 2.5 out, which means it's positive, that's good. And for cooling, it's between 3.61 to 6.5. And so it's a better cooling system than it is a heating system, generally. However, as I said earlier, greenhouses always overheat. There's so much energy coming through this glazing surface. And so another innovation that we've developed in the last couple of years is the addition of a garage door. So this is a really inexpensive insulated vent that you can put onto a greenhouse. And so we set up the logic for it so that when the temperature in the greenhouse goes above 30, the garage door will open. And when it drops below 20, it closes again. If the user of the greenhouse wants to manually open it, he hits the button or she hits the button, a timer will get set off and it will pause the program for an hour so that they can use it for material handling. And so there's nothing worse than gardening when you can't get wheelbarrows or tractor buckets or large bulk material into a space. And so this is a multifunctional element in that it's well insulated. It's better than the glazing. It's about R8, I think. And it provides a huge utilitarian purpose for us. So I can bring my tractor bucket straight in there and bring compost in. And then as soon as this garage door opens, if I'm at 40 degrees inside the greenhouse, which is not uncommon, it'll drop right down to whatever the ambient air temperature is outside almost instantly. There's a little bit of mucking about to get a garage door to do this. You have to, they're not really designed to be programmed for heat. And so you have to play with them a little bit to get them to do what you want to do, but it can be done. So that's the same greenhouse I just talked about, the one in Morningside. And so the kitchen is right here. There's one root cellar behind the kitchen and then 2 underground. I don't have any pictures of that with me right now. This is designed to be a 4-season greenhouse. And this property ended up getting 2 greenhouses, which I'll show you in a second. So I was lying, I forgot, I just built this slide deck before I came. So I have a bad memory, I guess. But here's the back dry room for flour, beans, dehydrated food, that sort of stuff. That's our meat hanging room right there. And then this is the cold storage room right here that is fed by earth tubes. Now, these earth tubes are kind of cool. They go 100 feet under 100 feet to the north. They're below the frost line, and we bring air in. And so during the winter time, if it's really cold outside, the air for the root cellar goes underground and gets preheated to ground temperature. Meanwhile, the ground is freezing because we're bringing all this cold air there. So we're actually storing ice. And so our forefathers would have been going to lakes and pulling blocks of ice out of the lake. With plastics now, we can actually bring those blocks underground without having to go to the lake and haul that ice out. And so we're pre-charging the ground with cold by doing this. And the air then gets slowly blown into this root cellar right here. And so that means that that root cellar takes on the temperature of whatever's coming out of these earth tubes. And this is important because root cellars have traditionally been known to kill people, because as vegetables decompose, they consume the oxygen. And so what we did was we set up a green and a red light on the entrance door. And we did 2 lights because if one burns out, we have a redundancy. And so if it's green, you can go in, it means the fan is running. If it's red, it means that the pressure transducer is not picking up air pressure, and you better double check before you go in there, just to make sure that nobody's going to get harmed or hurt. The air from this root cellar has plant food, CO2, and so we pressurize this room and we inject it up into the greenhouse so that the plants can consume the food from the CO2 that's coming off of the vegetables. And that little bit of air actually has a tiny bit of energy that we can use. The other thing that the greenhouse has is a heat recovery ventilator. So we pull out humid air from the kitchen as we're cooking, and we inject the waste air into the greenhouse as well to benefit the plants. This is version 5. So I've built 5 different versions of greenhouses over the last 15 years. I've learned a ton. This greenhouse is made out of a structurally insulated panel that gets made in Calgary. I chose this panel because it's got no organic material in it, so nothing can rot. And so it's basically magnesium oxide, expanded polystyrene, and magnesium oxide with pressure-treated splines to keep the building, all the panels together. We've designed our own truss system with integrated vents. And so that's what those are right there. And so those are galvanized trusses. They have integrated curtains in them. And so as soon as the sun goes down at night, we can move thermal curtains across the trusses, but the curtains only go from one truss to another truss. They don't go across the whole system, so that we can still trellis tomatoes and other plants up into the trusses. So we can use the trusses as a trellising system and still get the benefit of a thermal curtain. And so this has made venting the greenhouse way more effective. The thermal curtains, in my opinion, if you had to choose between a climate battery and a thermal curtain, I would choose a thermal curtain every day of the week. You're way better off to try and reduce thermal energy than trying to replace it. And so if you have a glazing surface of 1.8 and then you bring a curtain across, we can ostensibly double the R value of that glazing, which will almost cut the energy consumption of the greenhouse by 30%. And all of this is automated. And so it makes the greenhouses very, very efficient. We're working on a control strategy right now. It won't be available for version 5, but probably version 6. That will allow us to integrate stepper motors into the curtains so that we can have a lot more control with regards to when the curtains come across. So if we want to reduce the amount of sunlight, or when you have tropicals, you don't want -20 air dropping on them. And so we could actually vent the greenhouse with the curtains at 90% closed, which then allows for air mixing to be kinder on our tropicals. So lots of innovation to be done there. And I'm almost done. I've just got 2 slides left. This is a greenhouse in Calgary that I helped design. This is version 2. And it's at a school for children with special needs. And so Hull Services specializes in helping kids that are coming off the street from all sorts of crazy situations that we don't need to talk about. And so Vaden, who runs this greenhouse, and the Market Farm uses horticultural therapy to help regulate the nervous system of these children. and has had incredible results with healing the mental well-being of these kids. And so he runs this greenhouse year round. He's got a giant fig tree in here that his kids just, they all fight over the figs. There's, I think he got 300 figs off of it last year. And he grows a ton of the food for the kitchen at the school because they feed the kids while they're there. They also are in a neighborhood with a lot of new Canadians, and a lot of these new Canadians are living entirely off the food bank. And they show up at his farm and they leave with 20 pounds of the most incredible organic food you can imagine, tears coming off of their faces because they haven't had that amazing food since they left wherever they came from. And so this has been an incredibly important piece in his educational milieu with regards to these kids. Hull Services in Calgary. This is a greenhouse I was involved in. I didn't help build this one in Invermere. And so this is a 2,000 square foot passive solar greenhouse. We did design all the outdoor gardens, all the water harvesting features here. And so this has a community garden, a food forest, a constructed wetland. And I just wanted to place this here because as you guys contemplate the construction of a greenhouse in your community to either supply food security or solidarity or whatever the driving force behind the creation of this hub is, the technical components, which I've just flown through, I wish I could have had 20 hours of your time to talk about all of these things, but the technical parts are actually relatively easy. Like we can design these things, we can calculate them, we can figure out what is optimal. The piece that requires the real work, that's really hard to get right, is figuring out how you operate these greenhouses. Because you can go and build it, but this greenhouse is a perfect example of it because Invermere in the summertime swells to 40,000 people, mostly from Calgary. All these Calgarians bring their Costco food with them, so they're not buying anything local. And then in the wintertime, the community shrinks back down to 4,000 people. And the people that are there can hardly even afford to live there because the jobs don't pay very much and the houses are really expensive because they're inflated by the people that live in Calgary who have a second home out there. All that to say is like trying to create a community organization in that community has been really challenging because people are barely able to make ends meet, and now like there's this volunteer thing that has to happen. And so you really have to think carefully about the operations and how you're going to have continuity on this piece of infrastructure that could last 30 to 50 years because it does require consistent and maintenance and upkeep in order to make it run. I guess there is one last slide here, and all this is to say is that within every community there are opportunities to integrate these structures into existing infrastructure. And so every ice rink, for example, has a waste heat source. They're freezing that ice, and by doing that, they're removing the heat from the water and they're ejecting it outside. And so it's not actually that hard to harvest that heat from an ice rink and use it to heat a greenhouse. Grocery stores do the same thing with their refrigeration systems. And in fact, we actually got asked to do a feasibility study for a thermal oil facility in Bonnyville to see if we could harvest the thermal energy off of the thermal oil site and build a greenhouse park using these structures. And so as you guys are looking for ways to, or locations for them, one of the reasons I like the idea of an ice rink or a grocery store, but specifically an ice rink, is like the ice rink in Canadian culture is our community hub. It's where everybody goes. And so you're not going to be able to go play hockey without seeing this greenhouse, and you're going to want to get involved, hopefully. And grocery stores are a bit of a hub too. And so I think it's really important, like the placement of these structures is really important because they can do more than just grow food. So I've got 2 white papers here. They're both free. If you're interested in learning more about these structures, you can go to the website just by taking a photo of these and clicking on the link. Happy to share this presentation with the folks at Athabasca as well if you want to get those. And if you want to get in touch, that's my contact card there. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about greenhouses if you're interested. Definitely do not have to spend $1 million to build a passive floor greenhouse. You can do it for a lot less money. And that's it. Hopefully I didn't go too far over my time. Veronica is going to come up and talk about, okay.
Okay, and I'll give people the mic so that anybody that's online can actually hear the question.
Okay, so obviously clear as mud. Yeah.
I'm allergic. For the greenhouse that you were showing it in Premiere.
Yeah.
That slide. It's not. Oh, sorry. Go back. Not this one. The one. Not this one. That's guy. It's not underground any. Is that something that you do? Typically, is that a good feature or benefit? I'm assuming that this one wasn't done because of the place that it was in. BC, it's rocky environment or whatever, but in Alberta, you could dig underground below the frost level. Is that something that?
So it does have a foundation that's below the frost line. But remember what I was saying about heat loss out of walls? So your primary heat loss surface is the glazing surface. It's not actually the walls. And so if you bury this underground, the economics that you have to do in your head is the cost of digging a hole and shoring it up less money than the cost of building a wall system. Like there's not a huge, in fact, there could be a thermal detriment because the earth is like at most when you go down 10, 12 feet is like 6 or 7 degrees Celsius. So the inner surface of these walls is going to be like 15 to 16 degrees Celsius. So it's expensive to dig holes. It's really expensive to shore those holes up. And then if you do dig a hole, you have to make sure you don't have groundwater that you're contending with. And you also have to make sure that the grading around that hole is done properly so you don't end up with a pond with a glazing surface on top of it. So for me, I'd rather build up than to build in. Generally speaking, I think it's going to be more cost effective. I get that question so much that I wrote a blog called Rob's Modified Wallopini, because that's what a lot of people refer to them as. They're called Wallopinis. And I said, if I was forced into a corner to build one, here's how I would do it. But generally speaking, I think you're going to be happier with a system like this than trying to embed something into a pit.
Can you put a subtitle of "Dig Up Stupid"? Would that be good?
Dig up, yeah. Well, it's not stupid. I think, like, actually, you know where this comes from? So the Russians during when they were the USSR grew all of their own citrus in greenhouse pits like this. So I think that there's a case for it. I think that, like I said, the economics you have to do is like, is it cheaper to put it into a pit or earth shelter it than to build it up? And in fact, I'm working on a greenhouse in a First Nations community in BC, and the only place we can build the greenhouse is on the side of a mountain. So it's going to be earth sheltered, but it's still going to have the same wall system that we have here. The earth is going to be coming up against it because we need to shore the earth. Like we can't just dig a hole and let the earth kind of sit there because it'll slump, right?
Thanks so much for your presentation. So regarding the climate battery, are there any considerations for soil type? Are there certain types that work better for dispersing and storing that energy?
There's a guy up in the Yukon. His name is Bob something. Can't remember his last name right now. He's the coolest dude I think I've ever met. He's a school teacher, and he has invented really low-tech passive solar structures, like basically 2 raised beds with a hoop over top of it. And he created a cobble heat storage system, which is actually out of, it's crazy. There's books from the 1970s during the oil embargoes that happened. Engineers went nuts trying to figure out how they could live without oil, and then all of a sudden that disappeared, and all of this wonderful knowledge about heat storage disappeared. You can still find it in old books if you go to bookstores. I have a couple of them at home. Anyways, he puts these melon-sized cobbles underneath his garden bed, and he runs the air past them. So he doesn't have any of the manifold stuff I talk about here. And spherical cobbles are really interesting because they have a really high volume to surface area ratio. So they take a long time to heat up, but then they also take a long time to cool down. And if you get the cobble size right, that means that the space between the rocks is sufficient to allow air to kind of migrate through. You can now get the whole mass heated up. And so it's a more efficient way of storing that thermal energy. I don't know how much more. When we get into greenhouses that are hundreds or thousands of square feet big, the thought of having to haul in that much cobble seems irresponsible, especially when we've got all this native material. The big thing that I emphasize when I'm constructing these things, because I actually will be out there building them with these folks, like I don't like using like gumbo clay. Not because it doesn't store heat, but you can imagine trying to like squeeze the gumbo clay in between all those weeping tiles. It's a disaster. So free-flowing soils, typically subsoils, are best from a constructability perspective. You can even use topsoil, like black dirt. And so we'll put 4 feet of black topsoil into a greenhouse. If we don't have, like in Kamloops, we don't have a lot of soil like we have out in Alberta. And so we actually use the silty subsoil that they have there, which go around the pipes really nicely. And then we use, he showed up with a couple dump trucks full of soil, and it's like, this isn't topsoil. What is this? This is subsoil. Like, no, this is the best topsoil we have in the valley. And it's like, well, we can't use this the way it is. Luckily, there's a ranch just down the road. And so we brought up a couple dump truck loads of composted manure, and it started to slowly, like, Alberta doesn't know how good it is here. You know, it's like we have such amazing soils here compared to you go to BC and it's just, oh my gosh. This is the land, this is the promised land. And I've lived in both provinces. So whatever you have access to that's cheapest, that will flow around those pipes is the answer.
Awesome, thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect, thank you. Thank you so much, Athabasca University, Kara, Mike, Science Outreach, and everyone for being here tonight. It's just a wonderful opportunity to be here. My name is Veronica Madonna. I'm an associate professor at the REIC Center for Architecture here at Athabasca. I'm also an architect and I've been practicing architecture for over 20 years. Thanks, Rob, for that inspiring presentation. It's gonna be hard to follow, that's for sure. Now, I'm not a greenhouse expert, but I did watch my grandfather and my grandmother, who are immigrants to Canada, come to Canada, and they grew their own gardens. They covered the gardens when this cold season started to come. They harvested their garden and they preserved it, and they basically ate only the food that they grew in their backyard all year round. And this was in the middle of Toronto, by the way. So, you know, it's a really wonderful thing to kind of see how, you know, local production of food can really kind of help sustain, even on a small scale, you know, families. My work in architecture is really in the area of community-based design. It's also in the area of looking at passive methods to reduce carbon and energy usage of our buildings, as well as thinking about local bioregional materials, meaning materials that come from the earth that have low carbon, that have low intensive processes to produce, and that are also regional to communities in order to reduce carbon footprints of our buildings. So as part of the presentation tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about almost next steps in terms of the process, which involves community-informed architecture, and also share a little bit of information on regional materials that falls under a regenerative framework, which is an area of focus of research that we do at the Center for Architecture, and Rob had also talked about it, and it's really important and vital to how we believe the built environment should be approached. Sorry, I have two slides going here. So tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about a regenerative framework and considering how we could use that in designing a passive solar greenhouse, taking all the expertise that Rob has shared with us, as well as kind of leaving you with a top 7 priorities in thinking about, you know, some of the things to think about when you're looking for a site, or maybe even looking to start to approach the design of one of these buildings within your own community. We're going to look at bioregional materials, and then we're going to end off on a discussion about participatory design, because we believe that any building or any kind of infrastructure that's built really should be built with community, and then talking about a process in which I believe the next kind of workshop we'll look at doing, which is bringing the community together to be part of establishing the needs of the greenhouse. Oops, okay. Step 1 back. There we go, okay. Oops, okay. A little click happy here. Okay, so I live in Toronto, and so I live in an urban environment, but I grew up mostly in Southern Ontario in rural areas. Surrounding me were farmlands like this. So I really started to kind of gain an appreciation for the land and thinking about what the land offers us, and how we should really kind of value that. I also lived in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and you know, here in Nova Scotia and anywhere along a coastal city, it's really about the water and how important the water is in order to kind of sustain life, and what that has to offer us. So when, you know, I started to kind of think about architecture and the fact that every time we build a building, whether it's a greenhouse or a school or an office building, we really are impacting the ecological system. And so we really need to kind of take that, really, you know, we need to be very responsible in how we do that. So this is one of my building designs for Honeybee Research Center for the University of Guelph, which looked at and was a model for how can we reduce the impact of a building on the ecological systems. The building was dedicated to research the impact on honeybees and the decline of honeybees. And the building was a response to thinking about passive systems and how the building itself, the form works to create natural ventilation. It opens views to daylight to reduce lighting energy, and it makes a connection to nature so that as people are walking through, we really start to remind ourselves we have a big responsibility when we're either visiting a building or designing a building, to think about our impact on the earth and on our ecological systems. Even in urban environments, you know, I work a lot to kind of try to integrate vegetation and landscape elements to cool buildings down and to kind of create a positive impact for our health and wellness on people when we experience the built environment. This is another one of my buildings that has just recently completed construction. It's actually a 10-story wood mass timber building that's designed to be net carbon zero. And what that means is that this is in the middle of Toronto. It's for George Brown College, and it's meant to serve about 5,000 students. but it's designed with a mass timber system, so a wood structure, which is a bioregional material, but also has 2 solar chimneys on either end of the building, which means that it's designed to work with a chimney effect so that it does natural ventilation for about 6 months of the year. Toronto is very humid, but it's also be very cold. But in the shoulder seasons, the mechanical system will completely shut off in this building. And the form is also generated to consider sun. So it's angled towards the south to kind of gain exposure for solar panels to create energy. And it's also worked to optimize daylight for the classrooms to keep the lights off. So in many ways, it has very similar principles to how we need to think about even greenhouse designs in terms of thinking about our climatic situations and how we respond to that, specifically for the regions we're designing for. Our work involves looking at guides to help communities understand how to build wood buildings, which is a great resource here in Canada, and as well as thinking about advancing that next level of bioregional forest-based materials in the industry to help reduce our dependency on fossil fuels and the materials that we use in buildings. And so to kind of start and frame the conversation as next steps, I wanted to talk about what we talk a lot about at the Center for Architecture, the idea of a regenerative framework, and think about holistic opportunities in a local food production and how we can apply that to passive solar greenhouses in order to help guide, the community's next steps to designing these buildings. And so, to define a regenerative framework, simply, it's about moving beyond sustainability, kind of being neutral, and creating a positive impact across social, cultural, and ecological systems. And it's really important that they work together in that. And so when we think about the principles of regenerative design, we really are looking at systems that work in harmony with nature, that creates closed loops, meaning that it minimizes waste and reuses resources. Looking at restoring ecological and social well-being. So, Rob talked a lot about social programs that could happen in conjunction, as well as the idea as, horticultural therapy and the impact on health and wellness. These kind of are all really important in the social considerations when we think about buildings of any type. And then, this is really important, but thinking about long-term resiliency and adaptability. And I think now more than ever, as Canadians, we're really thinking about what is our resiliency in our space today. And, thinking about not only where our materials are coming from or where they're being produced from, but also just for next generations and thinking about our actions today for the next generations. And are we having a positive impact on that? So regenerative design, I'm not going to read this out, but it's buildings and communities that operate within their site's resource limits. And so it's really about thinking about the region, the place, the site, and being very sensitive to that and learning from the land and responding to that in your designs. It's a holistic approach to development. So why can this be important? Well, passive solar greenhouses integrate natural energy flows naturally. And so, they create self-sustaining growing environments using less energy, less carbon, and producing food, so creating food security. And so some of the key things that we can think about is sun and heat capture. So we want to kind of have the sun, but we also want to think about thermal mass and how we can capture heat and release it during the cold seasons, as Rob explained. Water efficiency. So, we should be collecting water from these buildings so that we could reuse it in the irrigation systems of the buildings. Thinking about healthy soil systems. So, anything that is kind of being grown from the earth, we really need to consider the health of that earth over time, as well as, when we start. And then, thinking about biodiversity and pollinator support. So, growing food appropriate for the seasons and for the region in order to keep the biodiversity going. And then, thinking about how pollinators can help support the growth of that as well. And so, ultimately, it's to reduce import food dependency. It's to create food that's controlled by community, that is about food security and community resiliency. And, you know, it's the idea of local materials, local labor, and local markets is this idea of a circular economy. So this is a term that's being used a lot these days, but it's really about having, again, that closed loop system where we can kind of really use, reuse, dismantle, and use again, rather than constantly taking from our natural resources. And, you know, the greenhouse is an amazing educational and community hub. So over the last 2 years in the Center for Architecture, we took students to Lesotho, which is in Southern Africa. And what we saw there was that, you know, growing food was becoming a really important conversation in the educational system for children, because not only was it a community hub and educational component, but it was also about giving knowledge to sustain food security for the future. And so I think these are really wonderful opportunities that greenhouses and communities can provide. And, you know, of course, in my work, I really think a lot about and you know, research and study the impact of health and wellness, and how, you know, the impact of our built environment, and how being around nature, which is known as biophilia and our inherent desire to be in nature, impacts us. So, you know, a recent study has shown that people who garden daily actually have reduced stress levels. And I think we can probably all kind of attend to that. Like, being in nature makes us feel, I saw some shaking heads. Depends on the level of gardening, I guess. But when we think of a regenerative framework, we have to move outside of our traditional development models, which is cost, lowest cost, fastest schedule, and, you know, function. You know, this is kind of the equation of which a lot of the development in our world looks at. And we kind of need to move towards regenerative development models, which are based on shared values. So what is the shared value with our environment? What's the shared value with the community people, our social systems, and even our economic systems? You know, it all has to come into play in order for it to really work, but it has to be based on a shared value system. And I love doing these diagrams because it starts to kind of really simply highlight this kind of radiating impact that when you think of a regenerative framework, it can have. You know, you have your environment, your economic, your social and cultural impact, but then surrounding that, what does that mean? It means food security. It means strengthening our bioeconomy in our country and in your regions. We can have job creation and skills development. Thinking about energy transition, moving from fossil fuels to more natural resources of energy, a health and wellness and resiliency, and kind of our dependency in how we react now to global tensions, which is becoming a real thing that we have to deal with. But it's also about, you know, thinking about biodiversity loss, climate change. And I think this is kind of interesting, thinking about food as a supply chain, which is kind of really what's happening today. Food is a right for everybody. It shouldn't be a supply chain like buying, you know, a pair of shoes at the store. And so to think that food is part of the supply chain, and that if the supply chain breaks, that, you know, element can be taken away from community. I think we have to think differently about that now. But, you know, ultimately, you know, thinking about all of this, we also need to touch upon climate change. And what's really kind of concerning is that Canada's north is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world because of climate change. So the impact of the whole world is really kind of being very much felt in northern communities. And we actually heard that today. We had a brief session earlier, and we heard that, you know, even just a slight kind of change in the temperature, you know, a kind of unexpected heat wave could really impact the growing for months to come. And a lot of that is kind of due to climate change, the kind of rapid changing of our climate and environment. So, you know, we can become models for not only our own country, but for the rest of the world. So when we think of a regenerative framework, you know, we kind of think about, 7 principles, and we kind of developed this in the Center for Architecture, and I've adopted it to the passive solar kind of greenhouse thinking. So cooperative and collaborative planning, this is key in how we approach any building. We need to work as a community, and we need to work together to understand the needs. So community-led design, and this is going to be part of the next steps of the project, and that's why I'm bringing it up today. But it's also about co-creation and skills building. Being kind of trained in community-led processes can then allow communities to take that and go with it on their own to develop other types of buildings. Shared governance and stewardship. So, supporting cooperative models and thinking maybe differently about our economic and business systems. And then how do we scale and share the knowledge, right? It's not about someone having a keeper, not about the consultant that knows it all, but it's about how do we share that knowledge so that it empowers communities moving forward. And that's kind of our what we're doing in a lot of our research projects and thinking about that. So the second principle is discover and respect cultural and social diversities and opportunities. So again, thinking about sharing and learning from traditional practices. Passive design is not a new thing. This is how buildings were designed many years ago, but we've kind of forgotten that. And now we have to come back to thinking about orientating a building towards the right position of the sun, thinking about how to capture air, to move air through. How do we capture, daylight? But it's also about social equity and adapting to specific contexts. And I think that's really important. And so when we think about the impact, we heard, some of the projects that Rob's working on, we can integrate programs with children's and communities for learning opportunities, therapeutic opportunities to kind of help support mental and physical health. Food security, of course, is really critical in every community. And, we can then move that towards thinking about economic opportunities for communities, such as community kitchens and productions. And so I just kind of put together a list more for a takeaway for after, so I'm not going to go through it all, but the first steps in developing a building is developing a program. What are the needs of this greenhouse for you? Is it just simply growing, or would you like a community space? Would you like to host educational programs? Would you like root cellars? What are the needs? And so the program identifies the purpose, identifies the needs, not only for today, but also for the future. So very important to think about what would future generations need, so the building can be designed to adapt. And then thinking about the environmental needs as well. And so the third principle is learning from the land. So again, this is like your site selection, thinking about where it can have great exposure. Is the earth, healthy, or is it contaminated in those areas? Thinking about building shape, your foundation, your soils, your opportunity to ventilate, which is really important in solar greenhouses. But it's also about thinking about the solar mass, or the climate batteries, and how you approach that, your insulation and what you use. And, one of the things we were talking today is that, greenhouses have, a lot of humidity inside of them, of course. But I'm really kind of interested in learning, can we actually use this as a model to integrate biomaterials? And so, of course, biomaterials have natural properties. And so we want to kind of think about, can we use them? Because I think if we can move away from materials with high carbon, we can start to create more circular cycles that the building itself works like the greenhouse, where it's a living organism. And then designing with whole systems, and Rob talked about this as well, thinking about the renewable energy, and can you use heat sources from other buildings in the community that, considering like district energy, earth tubes and biomass, water collection. So this is kind of like a takeaway list for reference. And I thought this was kind of neat. And when I was preparing for today, I came across this example where it was a passive solar greenhouse, and they simply built a pond in front of the greenhouse so that the pond actually reflects the light back into the greenhouse, so extends the sunlight period. And then there's the white surfaces that Rob talked about that then reflects the light again. So it's again thinking that whole system where it doesn't necessarily need to be a mechanical system, but it can be a natural system that feeds back. And then it's also a water reserve that could irrigate the greenhouse as well. So the fifth principle is maximizing waste and minimizing waste, maximizing circularity. And this has to do with materials. So thinking about the durability and recyclability of materials, which I'll talk a little bit more in another section when I talk about bioregional materials. And I think it's really important that we think about where our materials come from and the transportation of materials, how they're extracted. Each process has an energy and carbon intensity. And we need to find those kind of sources that are low so that we can continue to have to kind of address issues of climate change. And then biodiversity and ecosystems, so designing for seasonal changes and thinking about resiliency, as I mentioned. And then ultimately, the seventh principle is resiliency in itself. So building redundancy into systems. Rob talked about the redundancy of the lights, but what other kind of redundancies in systems can we build? And again, it's about, I think, this idea of future-proofing, which is about thinking about the future as well. Can we create a system that allows it to adapt over time? Because ultimately buildings change and even greenhouses will change in terms of your needs over time. How do you build the structure so that it can be adaptable? So maybe that's a space planning exercise. And so this is just a little summary, which I'll leave for when the slides are distributed. But moving into the idea of bioregional materials. And so bioregional materials is, locally sourced, locally processed, specific to the geographic region. And, Canada is in a position where we have such a wealth of resources and materials. And I think that, we're starting to think about coming back in understanding how we can benefit from that in our own country. And so, as I mentioned, not only is it locally sourced, but it's ecologically appropriate. So thinking about the natural environment and the climatic conditions in which it's not only harvested, but then used, culturally relevant. And so, reflect traditional and indigenous building practices and knowledge. That's an important kind of consideration. Low carbon and renewable. So thinking about natural materials such as timber, such as stone, clay, straw, and other plant-based biomaterials often have lower extraction processes that have low carbon, are lower in carbon, and then because they're natural, they also store carbon in their fibers. So that's kind of a biogenic carbon discussion. And then when we think about this, can we start to develop an economy, a bioeconomy regionally, that we're starting to support local economies rather than having big factories located in certain parts of the country? Can we think about industry and manufacturing regional in different parts of our, vast geography that we have in Canada? And then again, this is also important, but it's life cycle consideration. So not only the construction, but then what about the end of life? Can the material be dismantled? Can it be reused? It's much more important to think about that and think about, let's not put it back into the waste system. Can we reuse? And the reason we kind of talk about materials in construction and buildings themselves is that buildings themselves contribute over 40% of the annual global carbon emissions. And actually, I think this statistic has kind of raised. But we need to kind of think about that in terms of global kind of distribution. And the aspect of building materials is low today, but it's going to become even higher as we move into the future. But just as we have, our kind of food pyramid that we all were taught at school to respect and learn, we also have a construction material pyramid where, this is an easy guide that was developed to think about. At the top are kind of high carbon materials. So they're kind of like your aluminum and steel and copper. Now, these are materials that are used in buildings because they don't rot as easy and stuff like that, but they're at the top of that chain, so they have the highest embodied. So we want to try to find alternatives. Then you have your synthetic vinyls and ceramics, bricks as you're moving down to low carbon, more natural materials. Then you start to move into rammed earth and wood products, straw. and other types of biomaterials. So we kind of want to try to use what's at the bottom of this, knowing that there's parts in like concrete we can't really get away from. Steel, often we can't get away from in certain conditions. We want to balance it just like we balance our diet. And this is a great resource. I just wanted to kind of share the link that you can go into each of the materials and it can tell you more about the specific properties and how they're manufactured. And then when we think about maybe potential materials for a greenhouse, you know, there's a lot of opportunities. We can think of wood in terms of the structure and its frame. Wood is, I'll talk about it in a minute, but we also can think about straw bale for the thermal properties, rammed earth, again, for thermal properties. And, you know, something that we were speaking about earlier is perhaps hempcrete. And that's kind of a newer product that is starting to come because it's made of, you know, hemp, natural material, but then it also has thermal capacity for storing the heat and then releasing it over time. So when we think about, let's say, wood, for example, again, it has good thermal performance and insulation. It adapts with its environment. So it's a living material, it absorbs, it releases, and it can be locally sourced. But it also, you know, you need to consider, especially in a greenhouse condition, the moisture and how to treat the moisture. So thinking about a well-ventilated greenhouse is important because you don't want the moisture to be too long on the wood or else it'll start to form mildew. And then you also want to think about pests. And so one thing to think about is the type of wood that you use. So wood that is naturally resistant to pests is a good option. But then also there's some treatments that you can put on wood and some natural treatments to protect the wood as well as protect it from insects and pests. The next kind of one that I'm kind of interested in because I was exposed to straw bale when I was studying architecture in Halifax, which is a very, very moist climate. It rains a lot there. But it's a kind of a traditional building technique that I learned from the Arcadian community in New Brunswick and northern Nova Scotia, where they used straw bale and they used thatched roofs to build their buildings. And the straw bale is working very well. And it could be a great thermal mass potential, but you have to be very careful on how the compression of the bale is done so that it can be fire resistant as well as moisture resistant. And then you often have to line it with a lime and cob mud structure on the outside to protect it like a plaster. But again, you know, thinking about, we talked about this too, rodent attraction. So you want to kind of design it so to prevent rodents from finding their way in and then they'll never leave the straw bale. And then again, combustibility, it's really about making sure the bales are compressed. And I think this could be quite interesting because, you know, we can kind of produce these locally in communities and they could be the thermal wall that absorbs the heat and releases it over time. And I think, Rob, you were involved in a straw bale greenhouse as well. So just kind of like the next and last section is about the participatory design component, just kind of sharing a little bit about what's to come in the community input and process and next steps. You know, participatory design is really a collaborative design approach that actively involves stakeholders. And it's about, you know, thinking about improving usability and functionality, making sure it's designed for the communities rather than having someone come in and tell you what you should have. Enhance social equity and inclusion. So, you know, we find that when community is involved in the development of buildings, they care for the buildings and they're invested in the buildings. And that's that kind of sense of ownership and then community resilience to maintain it over time. And again, it encourages sustainable and regenerative practices. We can talk about sustainability and talk about regenerative practices to kind of help put those ideas forward. And then reduces risk and conflict. Ultimately, we all are going to have different needs and desires, but if we can have a consensus on what the buildings need together, then it's consensus building. And it supports innovation and co-creation, and it's an opportunity for skill sharing. So I wanted to share this slide. This was an image from, and that's one of our students at Athabasca University. when we went to Lesotho last year, and then we were there in 2023 as well. We worked with the local community in Lesotho, and we did a participatory design workshop with the community in order for us to design a structure for them. And so in that exercise, we spent pretty much a half a day together, and we were in small groups, and we did about 6 or 7 activities, and every 20 minutes we rotated. And we worked with, local government agencies, ministries. We worked with, this year we were designing a daycare, so we worked with parents, we worked with the teachers, the principals. We also invited the children to come in to share their thoughts. And what we did is we learned and gathered a ton of information from various perspectives that allowed us to kind of really understand wholesomely the priorities of the community. And so these are all the potential stakeholders that can be invited in order to provide input. It's really dependent on the community and what you're building. And really the key values of participation is that, we have full participation, and that everyone has a voice in the workshop, and everyone has an opportunity to provide that voice. So that's why we kind of break it out into smaller groups. Mutual understanding and respect. We might not all agree with each other, but we want to have mutual respect to allow people to share their opinions. Creating inclusive solutions that we've developed together, and ultimately creating a shared responsibility system that will be the result of that. And so some activities that can, and of course they get tailored depending on the design objective. We can talk about problems and solutions. We can talk about daily routines. We can talk about priorities. Participatory mapping. We found one of the most effective exercises is to actually give everyone, a pencil and a piece of paper and actually draw out, what you would imagine your greenhouse to look like and to have. And think about the quality of space. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone for your time tonight and for coming out. It's been really great to come to Athabasca, and it's really wonderful to be part of this university, and thanks everyone for being here.
I just want to tell Rob that one of the great natural resources we have here, if you ever farmed, you know that there's endless piles of cobblestones all over farms here. And so there's no problem with getting heat storage elements.
Perfect.
The other thing I want to say was, although not all of us are in love with the new, how shall I call him, man in the South, that today he's done us a great favor. And I was reading a little CBC article today from a logger in Northern Ontario who said, yeah, we've lost a lot of our export market, but maybe it's time we got back to using our local fiber, our local lumber for building our own houses. There's such a shortage of houses. So I think there's wonderful opportunity here in this area of producing our own food. We're going to have to produce our own. That's one thing as Trump has done for us. I don't know how long you'll last. I hope not very long at all. We really do need to grow our own food. We need to build our own house. That's what we did, 100 years ago or 70 years ago. And I think that this is a wonderful opportunity, and Donald has done that for us. So thank you, Don.
Hi there. Thanks for your presentations tonight. I was just curious, with the feasibility studies that have been accomplished, and you've shown that passive solar greenhouses work in climates, is there any plan to actually build one here in this community? You're talking to stakeholders and all of us present that love to go to the farmers markets on Saturdays, and locally grown produce would fly off the shelves. But is there actually a plan here at the time with Athabasca University or the town to actually build a greenhouse?
think this is a question.
Oh, there's the doctor.
Well, this is what this is all about. I think we're taking 5 steps towards that discussion. So we thought we would start by just giving people a chance to meet each other and start to talk with each other about local food issues and what a hub could look like, where people who farm here and people who grow food here and garden here could talk with people who just consume and say, how do we do this? How do we make it work? There's lots of models and we got access to research, but basically we got to adapt it for our own community. And I'm hoping that in the workshop in May, people will come out and do this kind of workshop that we're talking about here to say, what could we build? I mean, the research we're going to do, the findings that are here are available for anybody. So if you want to build your own on your own farm, there's people doing that already, and they can use the principles. But we want to put together let's say, what would a community garden and a passive solar greenhouse look like that's a public utility or a not-for-profit that's designed in a way that makes money but doesn't have to pay shareholders, just makes enough money to make it work, you know, and who would support it? Would we support it? And it involves a lot of those questions. How do we build it? How big do we build it? Where do we put it? You know, how does it fit in with your other shopping that you do in the community? And how do you feel about who would run it? Because we've got to have someone run it who actually knows what they're doing, and not a social scientist like me, but a horticulturalist or somebody who's going to say, that's a bug that we got to get rid of, right? So we've been talking about all these things, and I'm feeling optimistic about it. And I haven't talked to the university about anything about this except for my colleagues, but the university was a farm and it's still farmed parts of it. And so that would be a very interesting discussion to sit down with them.
He's ready to respond.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. Well, first of all, big theme of community. So just welcome everyone here to our community at Athabasca University. It's great to see everyone here, and welcome to each and every single one of you. This is just amazing and profound when we think, as you're sharing, about the produce, the local produce that could be produced here. It is just profound to me. And also that is not based on wishful thinking. That's not based on fantasy. That is based on science. Simultaneously, the least and the most magical thing. Yeah, truly profound and amazing things that can happen when we bring amazing people together. And I just really appreciate Veronica, Rob, and Mike. Just fantastic to see science and industry come together with research and community. And as we think about community, thank you for your leadership in bringing us together. As a large employer, thinking about the university or other large employers, how can we be part of the amazing difference and making this happen? That would be my question back to you. Thank you.
You said you were working on a straw bale greenhouse. How would that work with the humidity problems you were talking about? You need humidity resistant stuff. So is that like a clay plaster that can absorb a lot of humidity, or what does that look like?
So that greenhouse was built 12 years ago, maybe, in Canmore. So I was pretty skeptical of it. A colleague of mine kind of managed all the natural building components. I just helped with the shape. And it's working amazing. I was saying today that it'd be really great to get permission to drill a giant hole through it and like take a look inside and see what's going on with the bales and how they're performing. I don't think I'll get permission to do that, but what I can say is Canmore's probably even harder to grow in than here. They've got even more truncated sun. It's colder. And this greenhouse operates with no thermal energy input. It never goes below 0. And so I think that has a lot to do with what Veronica was talking about. There's a lot of embodied thermal mass in the bales. There's a lot of embodied thermal mass in the plasters. And Veronica and I were talking today about whether or not, I should know this. I don't though. For some reason, I had the impression that straw bale were vapor open, and Veronica thinks they're vapor closed. So her and I are going to have to check our math on that one. I think it's an interesting question though, because if it is vapor open, I guess it has drying capacity. If it is properly sealed, as Veronica is saying, then the plaster should be acting as a vapor retarder, meaning that the bales should be very resistant to humidity. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to kind of study even some of the work that's being done on the East Coast, because it is a very moist climate. The reason I think it's vapor closed is because it's also non-combustible, and the way you make a biomaterial non-combustible is to kind of basically compress all the air out. And so the that compression and just kind of, you know, learning as to how much to compress the bale so that it has a stability, but then also in conjunction with the cobbing, which is actually a very, you know, old traditional technique of, you know, traditional plastering of buildings, that forms the kind of protective barrier as well. But, you know, there's always maintenance involved as well with any building. And so, you know, it'd be interesting to kind of understand, you know, the technical aspects, but also the maintenance aspects over time and what that looks like.
Is about rammed earth. Have you got any Veronica experience designing with that? And for Rob, do you how are the soil conditions and the cost effectiveness of that in our local area? Like, I don't know how the soil would respond to that. I know a little bit about it, but not a great depth of it.
I have a little bit of experience with rammed earth. I'm not an expert in it, but I think it's something we should definitely look more at. I think one of the challenges we've had with some of the rammed earth buildings we're seeing being built today that are more of the contemporary, so they're mixed in with a lot of concrete, which I think is a unfortunate situation because concrete has very high carbon and then you're mixing it with soil. So I think, you know, looking at more traditional techniques of rammed earth would be really important to kind of get the right soil composition, the right compression. In fact, when we were in Lesotho last year in 2023, we actually were working with students from the Technical University in Milan and our partnering organization in Lesotho, and we're actually ramming earth to test it, like ramming just earth, no concrete in it. And so I think it would be important to kind of look at, let's go back to some of our traditional techniques and think about how they were done there so that we can learn from it. So I think that's something to look at for sure, because I think there's great opportunity there. I don't know if, do you have any experience with?
Not a ton of experience, but I have a fantasy of like we do a lot of property design for folks, and it's not uncommon for us to put in a pond. So we do a lot of broadacre water harvesting. So we'll put in water harvesting swales and large ponds, and depending on where the pond goes in the landscape, we can end up with a lot of extra earth that we don't know what to do with. If it's a dam, we use it in the dam wall. If it's just a dugout or a pond, we have a ready available building material. And so there's a company or a not-for-profit out of the States called Open Source Ecology, and they've got a design, an open source design for a compressed earth brick machine, which is a very common building material in the East. And you can build stabilized earth blocks. Like you can build enough blocks for a house with a couple jerry cans of fossil fuel, gasoline. And I think that when you look at the traditional Chinese greenhouse in China, the original ones were actually built with a double block wall of compressed earth blocks with an insulation layer in the middle. And that would be a great way of kind of getting a pond and a really low carbon building. And we know actually there's a guy in Fresh Pal, I'm always pronouncing his name wrong, Gyeonggi, I think it's called, his name is called. I have a video on my YouTube channel on Verge Permaculture. His greenhouse uses a form of compressed earth, but no cement in it. And the way that Chinese greenhouses do it is they have two like a wall system that can accompany the earth. And so there's basically steel ribs that go over the top and then steel ribs that go on the inside. And then they use low rib tin on those two walls, and they literally just pack earth in there. So there's this huge thermal mass. And they're able to build an acre of greenhouse for $100,000, which is like free almost. Like it's not free, but it's really, really cheap. And Gyeonggi doesn't need to heat his greenhouse, and he's in Olds, Alberta. So the only downside to those greenhouses is that you have to change the poly every 5 years because it uses a greenhouse poly. But that basically uses a form of compressed earth as its primary kind of wall system and thermal mass.
When circulating air underground in your thermal batteries or your term, or that loop that you had done longer, do you ever worry about bacteria buildup or that sense? And do you use perforated pipe or just solid pipe and for the best?
I don't worry about it because if the earth tube was feeding into my house and I was like, concerned about indoor air quality, there's lots of things to worry about there that, and actually there's a gentleman in the back, it's Trevor, right? Trevor's got all sorts of experience with this for, situations where you have high indoor air quality requirements. And so he'd be a better person to ask about that. But in a greenhouse, you're dealing with moist soils, rotting biomass on the ground, especially if you're growing the way that I grow, that we're like mulching our plants, and we're returning material back to the ground. And so like just the act of being inside of a greenhouse, there's microbes and fungi and all that stuff. And in fact, I actually think the most valuable thing about growing your own food, we talk a lot about nutrient density, and I think that's a thing, but very few people talk about the importance of having a probiotic environment. So when I eat a kale leaf out of my garden or eat a carrot right off, like I pull it out of the ground and I eat it, I don't really clean the soil off because I know what's going into it. I'm inoculating my gut. And there's a few doctors out there that are talking about this. And so just the act of being in the garden or the act of being in the greenhouse, you're absolutely flooded with microbes. The second question is, yes, we use perforated pipes. The reason being is that the majority of energy in air is actually stored in the vapor, basically the humidity. And so when we take warm, humid air and we run it through soil and we cool it down, we won't always get this, but at certain times of the year, we'll actually hit the condensation point of that air. And so the act of evaporating or condensing water is where all of the energy is. And so as I'm condensing moisture out of the air, I don't want it accumulating in the pipes. And so we actually use a perforated weeping tile so that the soil will actually absorb it. And then the opposite is true. So condensing releases energy into the soil, and evaporation releases energy back into the air. So when I'm sending cold air through that moist soil and I'm increasing the humidity, I'm actually moving energy out of the soil and into the air and then back into the greenhouse itself. So a climate battery moves both thermal energy and humidity. And so it acts like a humidity and thermal energy flywheel and will basically modulate the air system inside of the greenhouse.
Thank you. I'm a professor at the Athabasca University as well, and I did my PhD research in the earth tube systems in Canada, in Western Canada, for all types of buildings, for houses, for schools, offices, laboratories, hospitals, factories, and greenhouses. And the ground is a brilliant source of It's a very simple, cheap, cost-effective method of bringing outdoor air in these pipes, which are buried a couple of meters down below the frost line. And in the summer, as Rob says, they provide a huge amount of cooling for free, basically, for the cost of a fan just to pull that air through. So I've seen temperatures range from 40 degrees C. In the summer, it goes through this pipe and it comes out about 18 degrees. You can actually air condition a whole house or office or lab with that sort of temperature. And in the winter, we go from say -35, -40, and it will come in above freezing. So we don't need to put a frost coil on the air handling units. So it's a very simple technology. It's cost effective. It's thousands of years old, even though I researched it not that long ago. But you know, it's the Chinese and the Middle East, Persians. They use this all the time to cool their buildings naturally in the desert and grow food in really, really hot places to keep it cool. So I think just, you know, there's lots with the community that you're doing here, and obviously support from the university ourselves. It's really about trying to come to the most simple way of building and operating this. Obviously, there's a lot of research done that makes it tunable, which is really awesome. But sort of working together, practical methods and materials that are easily available, have been for centuries, and sort of working in smarter ways really to use them in the modern needs that we have. Thank you.
Do you have any resources on sizing these climate battery systems and total volume, total footprint, how many pipes, that kind of stuff?
Do you have a piece of paper and a pencil? I think my white paper has, it's been a while since I read it. I think there's a few things in there, but general rules of thumb, we shoot for about 5 air changes an hour. And so what we'll do is calculate the whole volume of the greenhouse. We actually, just before I answer that, what we did to come to these heuristics that I'm going to give to you, we studied the climate battery with a piece of software called Transys, and we tried to push the thermodynamics to the absolute edges in all the different ways we could imagine. And so we changed the pipe material to, like, instead of a poly, we changed it to like a theoretical material with infinite conductivity. We tried moving massive amounts of air and very small amounts of air to see how, and then like basically optimized it to what I'm going to tell you. We tried running the pipes in the short aspect of the greenhouse versus the long aspect of the greenhouse. And we studied that using finite element analysis to see how the energy moved. We tried using reverse flow. So we tried heating it in one direction, cooling it in the other, because we get hotter on where the air goes in and cooler by the time it comes out. In the end, the optimization is really simple. And so we aim for between 4 and 6 air changes an hour. 5 is usually what I get to. So I calculate the volume of the building, I multiply that times 5, I divide it by 60 in order to get cubic feet per minute. And that gives me the fan speed that I was aiming at. I even tried in the model using a variable speed fan, and so speeding it up when it got really hot and slowing it down when it got really cold didn't matter. And so I don't actually have really good data on how much pressure loss you get in a weeping tile. So I've had to like do this. It's been on my bucket list for a long time to run different air velocities through, but my kind of rule of thumb is between 10 and 20 CFM per pipe. And so once you know what your air change per hour is, you can kind of back calculate how many of those weeping tiles you need to go between the two. And then the airflow that you use determines the size of the manifold based upon the static pressure that you're trying to keep it underneath. And it works really well. Like that, those heuristics seem to give us a pretty good product. And then I just build it all out of off-the-shelf materials from Southern Irrigation, typically is where I go. The cost of a typical climate battery is between $5,000 and $6,000 in materials. And I've got a lot of other innovations that I'm working on right now. So I think there's a really big opportunity to put a mister on the back end of these things and use a controller to basically turn the climate battery into a swamp cooler. So as it's coming out the back end, adding additional humidity in the summertime would humidify the air and bring the temperature down even further. I just actually invented a whole new heat storage system yesterday, totally by accident, on this greenhouse that I'm working on. There's a new innovation in, I know we're talking about low carbon materials. This is definitely not low carbon. But ICFs are now being sold with faceless. So you can buy an ICF without insulation on one side. And so I think you could theoretically run the air down a concrete face on the north wall and build kind of like an active trom wall, essentially, before going into the ground. So there's literally like an endless number of things. Like as you start getting into this, you just start seeing opportunities to optimize and tweak and change. And that idea I just threw out there could easily be done with like a mud brick wall. It doesn't have to be concrete. You'd have to get rid of the ICFs, but there'd be a way to do that. In fact, I just thought about one. I'm a complete nerd when it comes to thermodynamics. Like all I see is, I don't see dead people. I see energy everywhere, and it's a little bit problematic.
I just like, we also worked with Natural Resources Canada on developing some guidance for the Earth Tube system. It's freely available online. There's a tool you can use to calculate the performance for any climate zone. I think the link is on the invitation that Kara sent around. And then Veronica and I have worked on projects where we've used Earth Tubes on buildings together. And we don't really have time to go into those today, but the way they integrate with the architecture and the ventilation systems is really really good from a passive energy design point of view. So yeah, lots of opportunities to sort of test things there.
And just real quick, what about the those curtains that close versus just a fan to run stuff under there? So you said that keeping the heat in is better, but it seems like a lot more could go wrong with that. Just, could you elaborate on potential for stuff to go wrong versus it's a better solution? But
yeah, I mean, I actually work really hard to remove mechanical systems from my designs as much as possible. But greenhouses are just like, they're an artificial environment. All of my vents on my greenhouse are all automated. And often I wonder, like, what would happen if the power goes out? All my plants are going to die because it'll get too hot in there. And in reality, like, I live rurally and the power goes out all the time. And I sometimes think about, like, well, what would happen if I don't have that energy and the power goes out for a whole year? Like, I'm probably not going to wake up every single day and like hand open my vents. I mean, I guess if we got into a really dark place in the world and we all had to like grow all of our own food and we didn't have our jobs, maybe I'd be motivated to do that. But and so, like, there definitely are moving parts in curtains. There's definitely moving parts in climate batteries. Like, I have a little computer that controls it. That could go. I have a fan that it needs to operate on. That could go. There are more moving parts in a curtain system, but from if you're trying to optimize for performance, the curtains are going to have a better ROI probably than the climate battery. One thing I regret I didn't put into my slide deck, because I know we talked about some of these expensive buildings, and you guys brought me up to talk about passive solar greenhouses, but you guys can do this for $20,000 or $30,000. If you don't want to go for the full 4 seasons, we were having a bit of a conversation today about 3 season versus 4 season. There's lots of pros and cons to all of that, but there's a company out of the US called Rolling Thunder Greenhouses, super cool name. And they innovated with Elliot Coleman a movable hoop house. And on another day when we have more time, You can probably outproduce any passive solar greenhouse with a movable hoop house if you're okay with 2.5 seasons for a fraction of the capital cost. And it's assuming that we're only growing annuals. So there's a few assumptions in all of that. And so when you guys get to the point of designing your greenhouse, if I'm involved in that, there's lots of inexpensive ways to achieve the same outcome or the same goal. And so I don't want you to leave tonight thinking that the only way to do this is to build these crazy passive solar greenhouses. They're super cool, but you can grow so much food using such low tech, inexpensive methodologies. Like one of the most incredible innovations in the last 20 years has been the proliferation of market gardening tools. So while America and Canada went really big in farming, Europe went really small. And so like one tool that I use in my garden is called a Jang seeder. And I can seed a 100-foot row, 4 passes in less than 5 minutes without ever having to bend over. That's amazing. Like I just planted all of my carrots for the entire year in between 5 and 10 minutes using a tool that costs $700 that I only have to use for a day, and then my neighbor can take it and borrow it and use it for a day, and like a community of 20 or 30 people can use that one tool. Now you've grown all the root crops and all the other stuff that can be hand seeded into the ground, whether it's in a hoop house or in an outdoor garden. So if food is the goal, don't narrow your options too narrowly. Like look at all of the stuff that's happening out there, because the gardening and growing food security market gardening space is just so alive right now. There's so many options. So it's called the Jang seeder, Jang. It's from South Korea. And I figured out all the wheels that you need for the seeder. So you can get in touch with me if you want a cheat sheet on which wheels to use for your garden.
So we promised we'd release you at 8 o'clock, so we're right there. And I'd like you to thank our speakers. It's been really informative. And remember, we're going to put the video will be online, and all the information. If you signed up and gave us your email, you're on our mailing list, and we'll share that with you. And well, first, why don't you thank these two, and then I'll tell you something.
And on behalf of Science Outreach, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight as well.
Great.
And Athabasca Grown for doing organizing this.
We're not done. So, next month we're bringing another Rob, whose nickname is Mr. Lettuce. So we wanted to bring someone who understands the business part. So he actually grows and sells into the independent food stores around Ottawa and in rural Ottawa around, and he's got a lot to share about how he does. And he grows partly hydroponically, and it's just a small business, but he's made a business out of it because it has to be smart. It has to be what I call a enterprising not-for-profit. So it's an enterprise. If we do this, it has to make money and pay for itself and hire a couple of people. And so keep in touch with each other. And if you meet somebody tonight, remember their phone numbers and you can keep talking, or you can ask us to stay in touch. All right. And thanks. Yeah, we got those. All right. We'd appreciate your feedback for sure. Thanks for coming. Wait a minute, because you might have won a prize.